My name is Margaret Chitiga. I am a professor of economics at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. So from where I'm sitting, it's a good afternoon to everyone. Our host has already introduced herself, Jing Liu. She is from the Center of Global Trade Analysis. And of course, we'll be recording this session at the same time also helping us to keep to time. We've already talked about how that will happen. So I will repeat by saying that our host will prompt us verbally when there are 2 minutes left to your 20 minutes of presentation. And if this continues, then the host will also then tell you to stop, and we will immediately go to the next section of the proceedings for today. So let me just allow me to say a few things about protocol and etiquette, which we all know now, given the pandemic has been with us for a year and a bit. But let me repeat anyway that please keep your speakers at mute if you are not talking. Only the one talking and presenting is allowed to keep the speaker on, obviously. This will help us not to have too much noise or background noise or disruptions during the 20-minute presentation by our distinguished panelists here today. After the 20 minutes of presentation, we will go directly into a discussion. Questions, answers, comments, and this will take 10 minutes. If you are a listener or even a presenter and you want to be voicing yourself, please type your questions or your comments in the chat box. We will then read these out to you. The presenter and I will help each other with this, and the presenter will be given a chance to verbally respond to comments or questions. So please, and when you type in your question, do say your name. It is quite useful to do that, and that allows for follow-up even after the conference. So do enter your name in before you send your question or you type your question and comment. When there are 2 minutes remaining within that 10 minutes of question and answer, again, our host will prompt us and we will start to wrap up that discussion and then move on, transition to the next presenter. We have a 2-minute transition period where the next presenter will be uploading their slides while I introduce them. The introductions are not long, it's simply the name of the person presenting and their topic. So once you are on the podium, you may want to also introduce your co-authors if that is important to you. And then we continue like that. So in this session, we are privileged to have 4 presenters. This is excellent. 4 papers. And our first presenter then is Miss Samantha Schreiber. From what information I have, she is at the U.S. International Trade Commission. The paper is entitled Understanding U.S. Workers' Exposure to Trade by Sex, Education, and Occupation. So without wasting any more time, Ms. Schreiber, over to you, and all the best.
All right, let me find slides. I think it's that. Okay, so can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So thank you for the introduction. My name again is Sam Schreiber, and I'm an economist at the U.S. International Trade Commission. In this presentation, I'll be sharing some recent research between myself and Marinos Sigas that provides a methodology to disaggregate U.S. labor in GTAP by gender, education level or attainment, and occupation. And then just for, every government employee has to say the standard disclaimer applies. This is the research of individual authors, and it's not expressing any views of the commissioners at USITC. All right, so I think there are two main reasons why you might want to disaggregate labor in GTAP, why you might want to go beyond the basic labor setting. The first reason is you might want to analyze a specific labor policy. And the second reason is that you might want to look at labor market consequences of a policy change, like trade, what we focus on, that's not directly labor related. And so the latter is what we're focusing on here. We want to understand distributional effects of trade on different types of workers. And there's a big appetite for this right now, for distributional effects of trade. President Biden's 2021 trade policy agenda describes a worker-centric trade policy, and in the U.S. Trade Representative Tai has described prioritizing workers when talking about when discussing trade policy in some of her recent presentations. So I think this is an important topic. But however, despite it being an important topic, the standard GTAP labor specification is not really detailed enough to understand who gains and who loses from specific trade policies. So the contribution of our paper is we're providing a methodology to disaggregate US labor in GTAP into 20 different types by gender, education, and occupation level. And we also provide a wage bill share matrix that we've calculated, and a set of elasticities from the literature that can be used in the model, that can be used as a resource. And then finally, in the last part of the paper and in the presentation, we run a series of simulations to illustrate how the model works, how these modifications work, and to understand exposure to trade by different types of workers. Okay, so before talking about methodology, there have been several other papers in the literature that disaggregate labor that I should mention. First, the most common way to split out labor in GTAP is by skill level into skilled and unskilled worker types. This was done by Timaranen and Narayanan and in GTAP in 2008. And I think there are many other papers that use this same division. Some other examples are Boringer et al. And Boconfuso and Savard. Another common way in the literature to disaggregate labor is by occupation type. So some examples of that are Carnero and Arbash, Colombo and Gisek, that use different types of occupations to disaggregate labor. And then less common, but increasingly popular and recently, is to disaggregate or split by gender. I think the Fontana and Wood paper on the slide that I list on the slide is one of the first papers to do this. Some other examples are Colombo and my colleagues at USITC, Girovich et al. And then there's a really great research initiative by the World Bank to provide a gender disaggregated labor database for a large number of countries that can be used in a CGE framework. So I think we're really excited to look into that, to use this and look into this research more. And then finally, some others to mention: Flag et al. Disaggregates labor by skill type, ethnicity, and nationality. And other examples, Dixon et al. 2011, models by occupation, legal status, and place of birth. And then we had a recent USITC seminar by Shenji Chen from Global Affairs Canada, and he showed us his model that disaggregated by gender, age, and occupation. So I think our research fits in nicely with some of the other papers that have done similar work. Okay, so when thinking about how to disaggregate labor demand in GTAP, there are two big obstacles. The first is how to choose your labor demand elasticities that are empirically estimated or data-driven. And the second big obstacle is how to nest labor demand, what hierarchy to choose. So with these two obstacles in mind, our strategy was to start with available elasticity estimates from the literature and then build the model and the worker types around those elasticity estimates. So we based our model off of a relatively recent Journal of Labor Economics paper by Johnson and Keene from 2013. And we chose our worker types and we built our labor demand CES structure to match their model so that we could use their elasticity estimates for substitution and labor supply. And we also matched their nesting structure in their model. So, which in their paper was described as having a good fit to their data. So both of these two obstacles that I posed at the beginning of the slide were answered by this Johnson and Keene paper from the literature. So in our model, we have 20 types. We have 2 genders, male and female, 2 educational attainments, high school and college, and 5 occupation types. And they're on the slide in that table there. It's management, business and science, services, sales and office, natural resources, construction and maintenance, and production, transportation, and materials moving. And the table at the bottom of the slide shows the 20 different types with the code that we use kind of throughout the presentation and in the paper to identify each of the types. And I think it's important to note we're only modifying US labor in GTAP. We're not disaggregating any of the other economies. So the other countries are following the standard labor specification. And where I work, the reason we did this is, where I work, usually we're mostly interested in US labor outcomes, but really the main reason is that we wanted to take advantage of the US labor data that we had available. So we had, I'll be talking on the next couple of slides about how we used the CPS ASIC survey to calculate the labor shares. That's a US-based survey. And the elasticity estimates from the literature were estimated with US PSID data. So our data was very US specific, but this methodology in theory could be applied to any of the other economies in GTAP, if you have the data. Okay, so here is our nesting structure that we imposed in the model. The elasticity estimates from Johnson and Keene are in red. And you can see that the occupations are nested first. They're highest in the nest, followed by educational attainment, and then gender at the bottom. And I think the idea here is that occupations, certain combinations of occupations are needed to produce a product or service, and then education types go next to potentially indicate the quality of that occupation's worker, and then gender is placed at the bottom. And again, it was easy for us to choose this nesting structure because we wanted to match the Johnson and Keene paper. And this picture, this structure applies to every sector in the US. So for every sector, the elasticity estimates are the same, but the labor shares that we use are different by sector. And I'll be talking about that in a second. And I think looking at the elasticities, I think they're relatively low, especially for occupations, which intuitively to me makes sense. You need some mix of these types of occupations to produce a product. The substitution elasticities are a little bit higher for gender, 4.76 at the bottom there, but that's still not as high as a perfect substitutes case. So this is a little bit different than some of the other papers in the literature. All right. So in the model, we need a wage bill share matrix by labor type and by GTAP sector to share out labor payments. And so to calculate these shares, we used the Current Population Survey Annual Social and Economic Supplement, the CPS ASIC survey. And it's an extremely useful survey for us with US labor data. It contains many demographic and economic variables for a large sample of people, about 90,000 people in the year that we used. And the nice thing about this survey is that for each respondent has an industry code, and these industry codes can be concorded to a GTAP sector. So by developing a customized concordance, we mapped each industry code to a GTAP sector, which gave us heterogeneous shares by sector. And then we used information about the respondents' occupation, gender, and education level to organize the data into 20 types for each of the 65 sectors. And then we calculated the fraction of the wages in each sector that went to each labor type to get the wage bill shares. And you can pull the wage bill share matrix from the appendix of our paper if you're interested in using it. I put an abbreviated version of the table at the bottom of this slide just to give you an idea of what it looks like. And you'll notice that for some of the sectors, there isn't any representation from some of the types. So for EEQ, there are no type FH1 or high school educated females in the management, business, and science occupations. And I think this type of thing is expected. We expect there to be some zeros. Okay, so that was the modifications we made to U.S. labor demand. Now talking briefly about labor supply. So we also modified the standard labor supply in GTAP. We relaxed the standard assumption that labor supply is fixed, and we introduced an upward sloping labor supply curve so that workers can respond to changing wages and enter or exit the labor force. And we are assuming a perfectly competitive labor market where the wage equals the marginal product of labor. So there are no frictions or wage rigidities built into the model. And just to point out, we're still looking at a national labor market with national wage setting. So we aren't simulating any subnational effects. And just like for the substitution elasticities, we're using the labor supply elasticities from the Johnson and Keene paper. They are listed on the table in this slide. And you can see that just by looking at these estimates, the female labor supply elasticities are slightly higher than the male elasticities, which is, I think, consistent with economic theory. Okay, so for the next 3 or 4 slides, I'm going to walk through some hypothetical simulations that we ran to illustrate how the labor modifications work. So I'll show you a simulation on services sectors, heavy manufacturing, and an agricultural policy change. And just to note, these simulations are purely hypothetical. I'm not referring to any real policy changes that are happening right now. So in this table, I list the 3 simulations that we'll be looking at. The first one, for the first experiment, we're increasing US tariffs by 5% on all ag imports. And the sectors that we're adding the tariff to are in the first row. And then in the second simulation, we simulate a hypothetical reduction in US services imports on all services sectors. And then last, we run an experiment that increases US tariffs by 5% on all heavy manufacturing imports. And again, the sectors are listed in the table. So for the first one, again, we're adding we're simulating the effects of a 5% increase on US tariffs of ag imports. And I have these tables sorted from highest to lowest. So I tried to make it very clear who is benefiting most at the top of the table and who's losing or having the least benefit at the bottom of the table. So looking at the results, the way you can think about this is the sectors that are expanding because of the policy change will increase labor demand for the types of workers that are employed in those sectors. And then the sectors that are contracting because of the policy change will decrease labor demand for those types of workers. So for the ag simulations, male and female workers in occupation 4, natural resources, construction, and maintenance occupations are experiencing increases in wages and labor supply, which I think makes sense because this is the occupation where the farm workers are sitting. And in workers in occupation 5, production transportation and materials moving have the biggest declines. They're at the bottom of the table. And females have relatively larger labor supply changes than males because they have the slightly higher labor supply elasticities in the model. And just to point out, I include nominal wages and real wages in the table, but I think the nominal wages are not really as informative to understand employment effects and, to get a sense of worker welfare. It's really the real wage that you want to be looking at that affects labor supply. So most of the real wage changes are actually negative, with the exception of the top couple of rows, the female workers in occupation 4. These workers actually have increases in labor supply, I think, because they're more concentrated in the ag sectors that are benefiting from the tariff. But for most of the workers in the model, the labor supply changes and real wage changes are negative. Okay, so then the next set of simulations are on services sectors. And the policy change that we're using here is a 5% increase in TMS, which is the shock in GTAP that's used for tariffs. I know services sectors don't actually have tariffs, but we're trying to be consistent across experiments to have the same type of shock in each of the simulations that we run. So I know, services sectors don't have the tariffs, but we're just trying to get at, we're simulating a reduction in services imports. And not surprisingly, we see that the workers in the services occupations are at the top of the table. They're the group that's benefiting the most from a reduction in services imports. And in particular, college-educated women are faring the best. And then occupation 5, the production occupations, are at the bottom because these workers are primarily employed in sectors that don't directly compete with services. And then for this last simulation, we're increasing tariffs by 5% on U.S. imports of heavy manufacturing products like petroleum, coal, chemicals, rubber, and many other sectors. And I think the main takeaway from this table, from this set of results that's different than the other ones I've shown you, is that the occupation types that you would expect to win or gain the most, maybe the production occupations, occupation 5, they're actually pretty low on the list. And the reason for this is, of all the workers who are categorized as occupation 5, only about 13% of them are sitting in heavy manufacturing. So the immediate, first order effects of increasing a tariff is a benefit to these workers in the sectors that are being tariffed. There are many other production workers that are in sectors that are contracting. And so it leads to a net negative effect on the production workers. So just to say this another way, if you're introducing a policy change that attempts to benefit production workers, it's kind of hard to target them because they're dispersed throughout the economy. Okay, and there's a lot of information in these tables, so you can feel free to dig into it a little bit deeper in the paper if you're interested. All right. So just to conclude, in this presentation, we proposed a methodology to disaggregate U.S. labor in GTAP into 20 types by gender, educational attainment, and occupation. And we provided wage bill shares to use in the model to share out wage payments to the different types. And we also included elasticity estimates from the academic literature that can be used as a resource. And then I showed a few illustrative simulations. These simulations had some nuanced results. For the sectors that expand as a result of the policy change, it leads to increases in demand for those types of workers that are employed in those sectors. But those benefits are, partially mitigated in our methodology by the sectors that contract. And so services, for example, we had benefits to workers who were in service occupations, but for heavy manufacturing, the production workers actually lost out because they're employed throughout the economy. In future versions of this paper, we have a few things we'd like to do. we'd like to explore other model changes, like maybe changes to the wage structure, maybe more disaggregated types, maybe looking at changing the factor ownership of the representative household, all to try to get a clearer picture of distributional effects. We've also discussed the data that we used in these simulations was the base year was 2017. We've talked about maybe using a more recent year because we know that the employment data has changed a lot since 2017, especially with COVID and other labor market shifts. And then we've also discussed potentially re-estimating the substitution elasticities and the labor supply elasticities, but with more recent data to see if those parameters change a lot. And that's about it. That's all I have. So now I guess I will open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Samantha. That was very, very interesting. So indeed, we open up for questions, but while I invite listeners to please type your questions in, I want to apologize because I forgot to remind us that this is a session on labor market issues and gender welfare, just in case there are people who are lost here, but I doubt it. So any questions, comments? We have 10 minutes for this. I don't see any questions. Zhang, you will also help me if I'm missing something. Sam, can you check as well? I don't see anything yet. If you prefer to talk, I think we can have that opportunity as well. So to our participants, any questions, any comments from yourselves?
Oh, I see a question. How is the labor supply estimated? Are you talking about the labor supply elasticities? Okay, yes, okay.
Massimiliano, you can actually say, if you can unmute yourself.
Perfect. Yes, you mentioned you had a positive slope in labor supply, and so that's quite interesting. But so is estimated from the literature. Probably you mentioned that, and is supposed to represent a trade-off between being employed and just being voluntary unemployed. So it's something that you think is affecting very much the results.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So first, the labor supply elasticities that we're using are coming from that Johnson and Keene paper that I referenced. And so it was actually very nice. We could just pull the estimates straight from their paper and we don't have to estimate them ourselves. And I think the way they have estimated those is they've set up a structural labor market model with the different types, and they fit the model to the PSID data. And then they ran this hypothetical scenario to estimate the labor supply elasticities, I think, where they said what happens if we increase wages by 1%, and they looked at what happened to the employment in their model. So again, we're just pulling them straight from their paper, and they're putting them in GTAP. We're talking about labor participation. So we don't actually have unemployment in the model. We're saying, if the real wage changes, then these workers would enter or exit the labor force. But yeah, we're not including any unemployment, anything like that.
Okay, wonderful. Any more questions, comments? Going once?
Maybe another question. So,
sure.
Yes, about the elasticity, still elasticity between occupations. So I'm understanding that coming from the literature, but does it have any kind of time dimension? I mean, I'm always wondering how you can substitute occupation. I mean, I see always more complementarities in production than the substitution. So I'm wondering also in the literature, what is the relevance and the impact of these as every nested function, you have the prices that basically telling you what is best to use. Is it, let's say, controversial, or I mean, it's impacting also results in your model?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's actually something that we've talked about as looking into more. Looking at altering or changing the substitution elasticity estimates in the model and seeing how sensitive the results are. The occupation substitution elasticities are pretty low. So I think that makes sense. To produce a product, you need some combination of these occupations. They're not like perfectly substitutable with each other. But that's definitely something that we want to explore more and look at how sensitive the results are to these things. So I think that's a really great question.
Right. Thank you. So, I mean, we have 2 more minutes, but I think we probably want to start moving to our next presenter if we have no more burning questions or comments. Let me thank you, Sam, again. This was extremely interesting, and thanks for the discussion in the last few minutes. So while he's uploading his slides, I will very quickly introduce our next speaker, Dr. Massimiliano Lamarca from the International Labour Organization. His paper is entitled Modeling Household and Labour Heterogeneity in Selected LDCs. Also looking very much forward to listening to this presentation. Again, just a reminder that you have 20 minutes and we will remind you through the host when you have 2 minutes and then eventually when we come to the end. So all the best and over to you. We cannot hear you. Just check that you are unmuted. You are still muted. Still muted.
Okay, here we are. Yeah, it was hiding the button. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. So this is I can say work in progress, a paper that I'm doing with some friends. My name is Massimiliano Lamarca. I work at the International Labour Organization, and I'm an economist there. And this work paper is been done with Badri, Sumati, Sindhu, Sudha, and Anita, which are not now connected. But I wanted to acknowledge it was a joint effort, and I tried to present all the components of this work. So first of all, let me see. Okay, I can put here and go. Yes. So what is the objective of the paper of the study is to expand the data set of the GTAP to include country-specific data with a certain level of disaggregation, in particular disaggregation for the households and the different form of incomes for the different form of labor. And with a focus on the least developed countries. I will explain why. And of course, the challenge when we are working with countries with limited data is to find sufficiently reliable sources and data, and to also, of course, we are facing a certain level of heterogeneity in terms of classification and data. So we have expanded the GTAP global database with 15 LDCs based SAMs, and so we're using also the GTAP modeling framework. And the purpose is to analyze the impact of the COVID, the economic impact, and possibly the social impact. I will explain you how. So just one word for GTAP model. Again, some of you are familiar with that GTAP model. The purpose is to structurally give more information on households, and so having an analysis that includes also a different kind of households, and while the standard GTAP has one regional households and includes both households and the government, GTAP can handle different kind of households, and also speaking the government sectors from that, so we can do analysis for fiscal policies and also poverty analysis. And of course, as a consequence of these heterogeneous having multiple accounts for the uses and the incomes, means that we have also to map into the source of incomes, which are labor, so it creates more dimensions to deal with, and more data requirements. So the factor inputs like labor are split based on gender, skills, and occupations according to the availability. And we're using some social accounting metrics from IFPRI and some data from ILO. And when not available for the specific countries, we use the information of the GTAP database. So just the one word, WhyLDCs. Many of you know this group, this category of countries. They are mostly in Africa. There are like 46 at the moment. There are some in Asia, and they are defined as those that are the most vulnerable. It's not just about the income, but it's also about low level of human resources and vulnerability, both economic and environmental vulnerability with prone to natural disaster, but also economic vulnerability because their production and trade is very undiversified. They are more subject to shocks. So in a sense, they are a group that have a certain, they have some similarities in these lack of capacities to difficulties in productive capacity, but at the same time they are very, very heterogeneous as a group. As you can see from the countries, some of them present quite certain challenges in having data, finding data. So we obtain 15 of those countries. But here I want to show simply the impact of one dimension of the COVID crisis was the impact on the infection, the health emergencies and impact itself. And it's important to show that many LDCs had so far a very low level of rate of infections. And then somehow that's quite a paradox, because while they didn't undergo strict lockdowns that we had in the rest of the world, the economic impact was quite significant. And I can show you here, for example, that employment declined in the LDCs and declined less than other middle-income countries, but incomes also declined quite significantly. Just 2 points here. I mean, of course, we always think that developing countries, poor countries, there is no unemployment, but in reality, there is the possibility to lose incomes, yes, but also to be temporarily permanent, stop working or working in very low productivity activities. So if we consider that as also a form of underemployment or almost employment, we can think that yes, there is unemployment in very poor countries or underemployment. In this case, it shows that it has an impact, either temporary or permanently, even least developed countries had some unemployment. Now, that's just the motivation why we are focusing on LDCs. Let's do the methodology. So we have 141 countries and 41 regions, and then we further split into 62 countries to LDCs. And then we use the SAMs where available. We had the 8-factor endowments from the GTAP and the 64 sectors. We just included the real estate into, the dwellings sector of GTAP into the real estate. And we updated the data to 2019 using World Bank data. Now, so the base year now is 2019. We still don't have the data on the impacts to 2020, so we still don't know what is our the effective impact. So we're going to do some simulation and see what the model tells us. So in the future, when we have this impact, we could calibrate also using that available data. Let me talk about a bit of the source of the SAM, mostly IFPRI and other debt. One SAM from Zambia was a SAM that we produced very low. Then if we have to expand the standard GTAP database with information from SAMs, we have to look into exactly the consumption by different households, their wages, and also the income flows from the generation of income to the use of income. So because the different SAMs, the different countries have different household classifications, so and also different, let's say, labor categories in terms of skills or occupations or even gender and urban rural, then we come up with a very large number of factor types and households, saying that we couldn't really make it homogeneous, but we can say we use this group as they are. If one country doesn't have, for example, a certain kind of household grouping, that would be a 0 in the SAM, and in total, then we have 84 kind of households for all the SAMs, the database, the countries. But of course, each country will have a smaller subset of those, and same for the factor types. In this way, we could use one model and use the one model for all the countries. Now, if you are familiar with the MyGTAP, there are some blocks, some headers of a MyGTAP that are commonly used. That is, for example, the factor used by activity. So we simply have to map. What is the contribution of employees, the salaries, total salaries, to different kind of factors, and that is information that we're taking from the SAM and we adjust into the standard GTAP database. Same thing, we have to map incomes from factors to households, and then consumption. So we have to obtain these shares, and then we split the GTAP database. That we preserve the classification in terms of products and activity of the GTAP database, because of course this is still a global model with many regions and specific countries, so that the work is focused on splitting within the countries of interest, and so that we can preserve all the linkages between countries as in the standard GTAP database. Of course, this implies that we have the different households' savings and governments and incomes, and so the model becomes richer. So these are the countries, the blocks. We have 15 countries, LDCs countries, then we have other developing countries, then we have other LDCs and developed countries. Now, in terms of sectors, just mentioned, we have databases for 64. We used a considerable amount of time trying to run simulation with all the sectors, but we find out that it's more effective to have a more, obviously, some aggregation at least at this first stage, and then we will also try to expand and have more disaggregated sectors given the database. There is always a trade-off, there's a consideration, there's always the trade-off between running an aggregated model in terms of use, simplicity, and computing time and interpretation result, and in this aggregated model. We started from a very disaggregated database because we think if we can run the model as disaggregated as possible, the result will be different than, of course, running an aggregated model, even if then later we can only present the result in aggregated form. So now, what is the shocks? What can represent shocks for the LDCs? First of all, there weren't lockdowns or significant lockdowns until now in many LDCs. So it's not a supply side shock for themselves. It is mostly demand shocks through certain channels, of course. The trade, the impact was mostly on tourism, on certain services, also some exports, on commodity prices, remittances, and of course these then also have effects on the fiscal balances. So it's a rather exogenous shocks for them. And also the challenge in a model based on GTAP model is to create a real demand shock for them, but also something that can have resemble a demand shock also for other countries in a sense. Now let's see what we have. Macro shock. It's exactly a reduction in the production and therefore export and imports from the developed countries, the other developing countries, an increase in cost of logistics, some disruption in transportation, let's say, and on oil price shock and following remittances, and also the biggest impact from the tourist sector. Of course, as I mentioned, we need to model also the reduction in the use of labor somehow. We cannot use it full employment, but we wanted also to have an example of full employment model and see the difference. Now, the one way to model that is to have a wage curve, which is a relationship between wages and employment. Now, the interpretation that we give to this wage curve is not really like a supply of labor, rather than if the demand of labor is reduced, the actual employment of labor is reduced, and because the market is such that if there is less demand of labor, we can also expect less remuneration. Hence, we can have a positive relation. So that's a different motivation from the positive relation between employment and wages. And this has an impact, of course, of both reducing employment and wages, and therefore reducing incomes in the LDCs. Now, in terms of results, we have a bit of a number of, let's say, shocks. We had the shocks, but we we have also the composition of the effects. And okay, we can see the total change in developed countries and LDC in developing countries and individual LDCs countries. So already the total change, considering the whole shock with all these components, is negative, of course, with certain differences by countries that we have to investigate. But interesting enough, we see, okay, for GDP, as an impact on GDP, of course, the largest impact has been the macro shock, the demand from the other countries, and the fall in GDP due to transport, to tourism and transport. Now, remittances, of course, does not affect much GDP, but is a part of the composition. Now, okay, investment, exports. An interesting fact when we are using models that generate substitution between different products, like the Harmington function, is that if somebody is exporting less and there is less competition of imports, then there can be some substitution, and there can be the LDCs can replace some of the imports with their own production, and therefore we can see some positive effect here. Now, this should be probably considered as whether this is a result of the model, of course. Whether this is factual or not, we need to clearly consider and scrutinize. So we also have a big outlier here, Malawi, and I can tell you we have to look into that quite carefully. And of course, imports are declining partly because of the incomes. Now we have vectors, so, and I probably rather go household income. So here, you can have an idea of the heterogeneity of the classification that we have in different countries. In general, you can see the impact is negative in a full employment model, with some positive exceptions, so not large, but still something that you see that when we run household consumption negative, also because of the remittances, and so we have an income effect. But then if I go directly to the unemployment with flexible real wage, you see larger, as expected, larger negative impacts. And so in total GDP, but also in the import and exports and in the demand of products. And I can go here in the effect on income. So it's definitely something that is probably more reflecting the reality, although data are still missing actual data. There is some data, but not to complete the picture. And finally, okay, in terms of income, so we have some decomposition by households, and you can see rather significant decline in most of the LDCs. Finally, by labor type, so we have the rural skilled, technical, rural skilled services, and unskilled. So we have a split for many countries between rural and urban, and skilled and unskilled. In many cases, we also have gender. Interpretation now of this variation, I don't know, well, then we need to find a way to isolate the sectors, see what is the impact, for example, in relation to the biggest sector that it's shocked by the crisis in tourism and those related to commodities, and see the composition, of course, of labor there, and see how this is affecting the demand of labor. Still some work to be done, and just probably want to mention what is the next steps. Of course, we have some conclusions that the shocks is affecting incomes more than production, but at the same time has an important impact also on the employment and underemployment. We need to investigate how this is distributed across groups. Another possibilities that this database opens up for us is that we can investigate how the compensation, the policies in terms of social protection, but also in terms of increasing fiscal space for the LDCs, can somehow offset these impacts. So we can have not only the impacts, but also the additional overlapping shocks of increased fiscal space, meaning that there can be some increase in spending, and through social protection, then going through transfers, using transfers. And this increase in fiscal spending can be motivated in the form of some debt relief, and there is all a policy discussion behind that, where they are benefiting from the SSI, that relief from the G20, but then also they are talking about having some restructuring of the debt. So all the fiscal aspects can be kind of addressed as a policy option and measure how much it takes for, let's say, compensating and reduce the impact. So that's something that is next. And I think finished.
Okay. Thank you very much, Massimiliano. Also very, very interesting to see how you can explore so many countries with more or less the same model. So thank you very much for that presentation. We go directly into our question discussion session. Let me invite comments, questions. You may type them in the chat box, or if you prefer, because we have quite a few minutes, you may already unmute yourself, introduce yourself, and ask your question, please.
Can I start? Can I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have two questions. The first one, I would like to know if you applied the same shocks to all the countries. That's my first question. My second question is, I saw on one of your slides that you were referring to migration. So I just wanted to know if you have implemented it, and if so, how? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So the shock is it's not for the LDCs as such. I mean, it's a kind of when we have a macro shock, is in the rest of the world somehow, in the other developing countries and developed countries, and then in a sense of in terms of possible effect of the lockdown, so reduction in production and trade disruption in trades. Then there is not a specific shock. It's not specific on the LDCs one by one. I mean, the way how are they exposed, they receive the shock, and that is a way to simulate a more demand kind of shock, and where the LDCs are more like passive and receiving the shock themselves. In terms of migration, there is a reduction in the remittances, and the database used is the shock. I think the reduction in remittances are available in the data. Let me see, using the nomad data. So I don't know exactly what is the amount of the reduction in the remittances, but okay, we will put everything on paper, and I can follow up on that. If this is there is not obviously changing in migration anymore. Probably this is the answer.
Okay, thank you very much. Maybe I can just ask a clarification question myself. I think did I understand correctly that you use the same model for each of the countries, the LDC countries? I was just wondering how realistic that is. Are there any warnings that you might want to give? I mean, I'm thinking Lesotho,
Yes.
Rwanda, and they are very different countries. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. In a sense, the same model, meaning that the model has the same structure. Then, of course, a lot of work was to have different data. We built this SAM. Well, basically, we merged some SAM into the GTAP data so that we could have specification of the country in terms of breakdowns of households and labor contributions and income flows, and that is country specific. Of course, then we use the elasticities and elasticity of GTAP, and in a sense, the model so far is modified only in the labor. The response of labor to this sort of demand shock. So, in a sense, the model mechanism is the same. Data is partly different, and of course, the limitation. Well, that's probably one of the problems why we can find the outlier. So, probably one contribution also of this research is to see also the limitation of having models that are structurally identical for all countries. But that's for the moment.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Any last minute question, comment? I don't see any, so maybe we can transition to our next paper. Thank you once again for this discussion and for your paper. Thank you. Our next presenter, as she uploads her slides, is Helene Maisonneuve from the University La Havre. The paper that she is presenting is entitled The Impact of COVID-19 Pandemic on Women's Welfare and Domestic Burdens in Bolivia. Again, we're really looking forward to learning what you found out in Bolivia. So over to you, Helene. You have 20 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Margaret. So this is a joint paper with Luis, who is as well sitting in the session. So so we have worked on this paper to try to see for Bolivia if women are bearing the brunt after this this pandemic. Okay. So Bolivia, as other countries in the world, is facing the corona crisis and has started to implement some measures such as social distancing and economic lockdown to prevent the transmission and the spread of the virus. the measures that were adopted affected the normal development of the Bolivian economy, and Bolivia's GDP has decreased by around 11% in the second quarter of 2020. For Latin American countries, and Bolivia in particular, this epidemic threatens to wipe out much of the progress that have been achieved in recent decades in terms of poverty reduction, economic growth, and gender equality. So, for instance, in Bolivia, the poverty rate has declined from 60% in 2005 to 35% in 2018, and we observed the same trend for the Gini index over the same period. The index fell from 0.61 to 0.42 in 2018. And this good performance of the country may be under threat. If we have a look at the situation of women in the country, we can see that women are less present on the formal labor market. They work mainly they work in a narrow range of sectors, mainly in services sectors such as the tourism sector, the education and health and social service sector. And the 5 main service activities in Bolivia account for around 60% of total female employment compared to 25% of total male employment. Additionally, women are much more likely than men to be employed in jobs designated as vulnerable by the World Bank. Consequently, women experience a higher national poverty rate than men, and in rural areas, women experience the highest rates of poverty in the country. Next to the formal market, in the non-commercial sphere, unpaid work is mostly carried out by women. Women spend 5.6 hours per day to unpaid domestic and care work, while men devote only 3 hours per day. If we dig a bit more into this gender division of domestic labor, we find out in rural areas, women spend 7 hours per day against or compared to 1.4 hours for men. In this paper, we tried as well to see what have we learned from previous pandemics and what are the impacts, or what do we know already about pandemics and women. So some studies dealing with the impacts of COVID-19 in different countries have reported particularly negative impacts on employment for women, especially because women in the world are working mainly in service sector, and this is the sector which is the most affected by the pandemic. For South Africa, Casale and Pozel have showed that women had to reduce their working hour more than men. In Argentina, women have fewer opportunities to telework compared to men, and this is due to the fact that most of the women are working in service-related sector or is in social sectors where it's difficult to work remotely. In Peru, the authors found that the income gap between men and women has widened as a result of the pandemic, and with the poor women being the most affected. Other authors found that in the US and in the UK, the least educated women are those who suffer most from the consequence of the pandemic. We find as well, or authors find out as well, that women are more likely to be I'm sorry, I'm just having a problem with my micro. Okay, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. All right, sorry. So women are more likely to be overburdened if they work remotely, as they are mainly the ones who are taking care of their family members. And in addition, the increase in the number of sick people combined with measures such as social isolation and school closures leads to an increase in unpaid work, overburdening women. If we look at what has happened in previous crises, like in the Ebola crisis, we found that women were more affected than men, even after the outbreak, as they experienced higher unemployment rate. So this comes from the fact that women were longer away from the labor market, and therefore it was more difficult for them to get a job after the Ebola crisis. During previous epidemics, like Ebola or Zika, women were more likely to be infected. However, their needs were not included in the crisis decision-making responses. If we have a look at the studies using CGE models, we can find that very few studies are analyzing the impact of the COVID-19 with a gender lens. We found the study of Chitiga et al. For South Africa that find that poverty increases more for women than for men. We believe it's very important to take gender into account in these macro studies in order to ensure that existing inequalities are not worsened, as it was the case with previous pandemics. Moreover, Davis and Bennett have reviewed recent disease outbreaks that occurred between 2014 and 2016, and they reported that only 1% of the total publications were focusing on gender impacts. So in this sense, our paper addresses to some extent the lack of gender-focused macroeconomic research in the face of a pandemic using a CGE coupled with a microsimulation to assess the distributional impact. So the model we are using is based on the PEP11 model by De Calloway et al. And we have changed some assumptions in order to better represent the Bolivian context. First, we have changed the production function or the structure of the production function, as we have labor, which is disaggregated according to skills first, and at a lower level between men and women. Then, following Fontana and Wood, we assume that we have endogenous labor supply. So we assume that there is a time constraint that depends not only on the amount of time that households devote to their formal market activities, but as well to their domestic activities. So in order to calibrate this amount of time available, we use the studies from Canelas and Salazar, as well as Lundvall, that found that women spend up to 4 times more time doing domestic duties than their male counterparts in Latin American countries. as our labor market is disaggregated according to skills, we could not find the data for Bolivia, so we borrowed the time allocation for Peru, which is a similar country. And there we found that skilled women allocate 4 hours and a half per day to domestic chores against 1.5 hours for male. And unskilled women allocate 7 hours per day on domestic chores against 3 hours for unskilled men. So the model we use is in line with the social accounting matrix for Bolivia. It has 20 activities and commodities, and we have 4 different institutions: households, firms, the government, and the rest of the world. Households are disaggregating according to their location, either rural or urban, and according to the gender of household head, male and female. In terms of closure rules, we follow the standard closure rule of the PEP model. So the nominal exchange rate is the numéraire. We assume that Bolivia is a small country and therefore work prices are exogenous. The current account balance is assumed to be fixed. And finally, government spending is assumed to be fixed as well. So to assess the poverty impact, we use a top-down approach, and we compute the FGT indicators as well as the Gini index for inequality. So I forgot to mention that the SAM we are using is the SAM from IFPRI, and for trade elasticities, we borrow the elasticities from Sevillano Cordero and the income elasticities from Morales et al. In 2017. So finally, for the micro-simulation module, we use data from the National Household Survey. So in terms of scenarios, I will explain to you the different shocks and scenarios we have implemented. So as you know, the pandemic is affecting the whole economy in many ways and through many channels. And as the pandemic is ongoing, we have decided to run 2 scenarios, a moderate scenario and a severe scenario that differ by the magnitude applied to the shocks. So for both scenario, we have 2 different channels. The first channel is called the domestic channels. The second channel is the international channel. So under the domestic channels, we have identified two different shocks. The first shock is about the productivity for the sector. So we assume that given the lockdowns that were set up, the productivity of the sectors have reduced. So following the CEPAL, we have split the sectors of our economy into 3 groups. The sectors who are slightly impacted, so mainly sectors that are essential or that were designated as essential, then moderately affected sectors, and then largely affected sectors, such as the services sectors, for instance. Then we assume that given the fact that workers have to work remotely, we have a drop in labor productivity. So based on some studies from Beverinotti et al. And Banerjee et al., we simulated a reduction in labor productivity by 4% in the first, in the moderate scenario, and 6% in the severe scenario. under the international channels, we have three different shocks. The first one refers to a decrease in the export for Bolivian commodities. So Bolivian commodities, the main Bolivian commodities that are exported are mainly hydrocarbons, mineral, and textile. And the exports are only to a very limited number of markets. So mainly China, Argentina, and Brazil. And these three countries were quite impacted by the crisis. The second channel we have under the international channel is a decrease in world prices in mineral and oil. And here we took the magnitude, the same magnitude as the paper from Shitiga et al. And then the last channel under the international channel is the channel through remittances. So Bolivian households receive remittances from the US and Spain mainly. So we took here the magnitude that was estimated by the World Bank that remittances would decrease by 20%. So in terms of results that we got, so all the sectors in our economy were impacted, but of course the sectors the impacts on the sectors were not uniform. Some sectors were more affected than the others, given the fact that they were, in our classification, already heavily affected, and whether they were export-oriented or not. Then, in the economy, we had as well sectors that were classified as not heavily affected at the beginning, like the food sector, but that were through indirect mechanisms that were or that end up being very impacted. So consequently, all sectors are retrenching workers. If we look at employment by gender, what we found is that women are working mainly in services sectors, as we mentioned, and therefore, as these sectors were the most impacted, then we have big impacts on women. We found that there were differences between skilled and unskilled women, with unskilled women being much more impacted than skilled women. Then if we have a look at what happens in terms of location, then we found that losses in formal employment are slightly higher in urban areas, and this can be explained by the fact that unskilled rural women tend to work more in essential agriculture that were least impacted by the shock. So as a result, these losses in formal employment lead to higher household burdens for unskilled women, which increase according to the severity of the scenario. If we have a look at the institutions in the model, so all the different economic agents are negatively affected in both simulations. And of course, the impacts are bigger under the severe scenario. For firms, they get their income mainly from capital income. We found that their income was dropping by 20%, leading to a decrease in their saving and the taxes they pay to the government. For households, so household income is decreasing as well, and this is due to the fact that we have a drop in labor and capital income, and as well a drop of overseas remittances. So female-headed households face a bigger decrease in their income. And this, we found this for both scenarios. Given that they have a drop in their income, they face as well a drop in their consumption level. They pay less direct taxes to households, to the government, and then there is a decrease in their savings. So for the government, we have a drop in income, so 15% under the moderate scenario and 25% under the severe, which is due to the drop of the different sources of revenue, as we have just mentioned. So the drop in government income leads to a drop in the current public deficit, which was already a matter of concern before the pandemic. So in terms of poverty, so at the base year, female poverty was slightly higher, and we can see that poverty is increasing after COVID, more for female than for men. So we have as well a widening of the gender poverty gap and the severity of poverty. In terms of inequality, the Gini index is increasing as well by 0.12 percentage point. And we found as well that inequality in urban areas increase more than in rural areas. So finally, in terms of the macroeconomic results, so we found that given the decrease in the production of all the activities, we ended up in a drop of GDP by 11%. And then I mentioned already the drop in consumption and in total investment. So in terms of conclusion, as we mentioned, the Bolivian economy was severely impacted by the COVID, and specifically with female labor-intensive activities being the most affected. Formal employment is affected, and especially unskilled workers, with women, in particular. So we have an increase in poverty, especially for women. And what we can say, that's my last slide, is that beyond Bolivia, this example can or could be translated as well to other Latin American countries, as they face as well this type of gender disparities in their labor market. And it's just important to say that there is no fiscal package that we analyze in this paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hélène. Thank you for a very interesting study, as always. Let me go directly to ask for questions, comments. I see that from my view, I don't see anything typed in, but as before, we could just simply invite people to come in and say their questions or their comments in the minutes that we have for this. So over to you, to our listeners, to our fellow presenters. Any questions, any comments? Just a small question from me, Hélène. I was just interested to know, just in terms of the data that's available in Bolivia. I know that in many countries, gender-related data is extremely hard to get. Did I understand from the Bolivian case that you have time use data, or did you not have time use data for you to use for disaggregating the use of time by women? Or was it now the Peruvian example that you took from?
So there was for Bolivia, but it was in terms of skills that we had to go through. We had to go to the Peruvian data because we did not have such a disaggregated data for Bolivia.
Okay. Thank you for that. Any questions, comments? I still don't see anything in the chat.
I had a quick question.
Yes, please go ahead. Please introduce yourself. Do I see? Is it Sam? Okay, please go ahead, Sam.
Yes, yeah. This is Sam Schreiber from USITC. Thank you for your presentation. I thought it was really interesting and very relevant work. What substitution elasticity did you use in the model between male and female workers in the production function?
So if I remember correctly, I would have to actually to check on in the GAMS code, but I think we used a very low value. I think 0.5 that is used in Fontana in the paper.
Okay. Okay. Thanks.
Oh, because of course there is no. We are not as lucky as you are, or as you were in your presentation. There is no estimation for Bolivia.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any more questions, comments? If not, then I just also once again thank you, Helen, your co-author, for this very interesting presentation. And we can transition directly to our last paper. Luis Escalante is presenting. He is a PhD student from La Havre. I'm sorry, I hear background noise. I don't know if it's on my side. Our host, do you also hear the same, or?
Yes, I hear the noise probably from Luis. Yeah,
okay. That's all right. So Luis, you are allowed to unmute yourself, so we will excuse you if there's some noise there. While you are uploading your slides, I will simply introduce the title, and I will hand over to you to do your presentation. The title of the paper is Evaluating the Regional Impacts of Climate Change on Women's Well-Being, Domestic Burdens and Food Security in Bolivia. So once again, we will learn more about Bolivia. And over to you, Luis, for your presentation, please. You have 20 minutes. Seems to be experiencing problems.
Yeah, Luis, we're hearing lots of noise, background noise.
Luis, if you can hear us, maybe you can type in the chat. Okay, there you are. There is a noise coming from your side.
It was good at the beginning when we were testing the system. It was good. Yeah. Now it isn't.
No. It might be useful, Luis, if you want to just exit and then come back. It might be that works. Yeah. Please bear with us, everyone. You may continue to ask questions to the three presenters if you had any. In the meantime, please. I have a question to all the presenters. I know that Samantha's presentation was more or less hypothetical, but perhaps I could just ask in terms of policy. Do you actually interact with policymakers when you have these types of very relevant research? And what is your approach to have the different policymakers in the different countries hear you?
I can answer if you want first. Oh, Massimiliano, you want to answer first?
No, please go ahead. You're right.
Okay. Well, for this Bolivian case, unfortunately, we did not have access to any policymakers. So I would say this is more a research paper, but under the PEP network, there are some projects that are run where the teams have to be involved with policymakers, and therefore I think it's much better because it can help. It can help more the policymakers and even us. They can really tell us what type of things they can implement, especially in terms of a fiscal package.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me right now? Or?
Yes,
okay.
Finally we can.
Okay, finally. I'm sorry.
No, don't need to apologize.
Yeah, perfect.
Over to you, Louis.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Margaret, for the introduction. And my name is Luis Escalante, and I am a PhD student in economics at the University of Liège in France. So today I present to you a paper of my thesis that was written with Hélène, who is also my thesis advisor. And the title of this paper is about the regional impacts of climate change on women's well-being, domestic burdens, and food security. So the motivation for this study can be explained by basically three facts. And the first one is that we have a consensus in the literature that climate change has negative effects on agricultural productivity and also in food security. And basically, they threaten the food security of the poorest population. And we have also a consensus that this is the most vulnerable population who will be the hardest hit by climate change, specifically in developing countries like Bolivia, for example. And the third consensus is that gender gaps can condition the initial situation of men and women, and these gaps also may worsen in the context of climate change. So we have some examples like Christine and Demetriades and explained, who indicates that climate change has negative impacts on gender inequality. So based on this, we have a context in general and particularly in Bolivia. And in general, we have some studies that include vulnerable population groups like Shitigan, among others. But most of them I always limited to the formal labor market. So they consider paid activities and they doesn't take into account, for example, the domestic work. In a context of climate change, Bolivia is one of the most vulnerable countries in South America. And the impact of climate change is particularly negative for the agricultural sector. And this can be explained by different studies in Bolivia. Anderson, Aliaga, Gemio, all of them agree that the most negative impacts of climate change in Bolivia are found in the agricultural sector. The agricultural activity also is relevant in Bolivia because it represents, for example, in terms of employment, 26% of total employment, and while in Latin America the average is only 15%. So we have, in addition to that, we have also a large presence of rural population, rural women that work in these agricultural activities. And finally, we can say that the gender and regional disparities in Bolivia are also relevant. As Elaine explained you, we have difference between the participation of men and women in the formal labor market, but also in unpaid activities. So we have more women that do domestic work, mainly in rural areas where we have where the burden of women in this type of activities is higher. It's really higher. Now I present to you this figure. It's about the relation between climate change, agriculture, and food security and food, and to explain the interconnection between these three areas. We have climate change that has consequence mainly in the agricultural sector. In Bolivia, we have the most frequently events are floods and droughts, for example. And we have impacts also in some non-agricultural sectors, basically in infrastructure, roads, among others. And these effects has finally negative affect the agricultural productivities. That mostly is negative, so we have a decrease in agricultural productivities that creates a deficiency in the food supply chain. And since some agricultural products are inelastic, or most of them are inelastic, we have an increase in food prices, and this increase in food prices that can affect some dimensions of food security. For example, food availability or the access to food, because food is more expensive, so we need to pay more or buy some products, and this affects finally the access to food for Bolivian households. We also need to consider two aspects that are relevant in Bolivia. These are the type of agriculture and the location. The type of agriculture we can find in Bolivia among all the territory, different types of products, like traditional products like rice or corn, or modern products, basically soybeans, or livestock production. And these three types of products has different resilience or different resistance to the climate change, to different types of climate change. And among Bolivia, in the other picture, we have three regions in this map: highlands, valleys, and lowlands. And each region is really different. For example, the lowlands region is characterized by a modern production, by a soybeans production, while the highlands is more traditional production. So that's why it is interesting to introduce these two dimensions, the type of products and the location, a regional location for agriculture in our study. That's why we consider that it is really relevant. So now the objective of this paper is to assess the extent of climate change in agricultural and non-agricultural sectors through regional impacts in the agricultural sector, to assess the extent of climate change on vulnerable populations and basically the women by region, and to assess the effects on food security. And in this aspect, we will see the change in some indicators of food availability, access, and vulnerability. The second objective of this paper, of this research, is to understand the interconnection or interlinkage between climate change, formal economy, and also the domestic work. To do this, we use a computable general equilibrium model that is linked to microsimulations to assess the effect on food poverty. So this study contributes to the application of CG models by introducing an endogenous labor supply and assess the impact of climate change on women's poverty, or women's food poverty and food security. The model we use is a static CG model, the PEP11. You can see in the slide the reference is from the Calloway et al. However, we modify some hypotheses in this model in order to analyze or to represent the Bolivian economy to a better to improve the representation of Bolivian economy. And basically, the main modifications was made in the labor market. The labor market was broken down by skill level between two categories, skilled and unskilled. And we introduced also a gender dimension through to constant elasticity of substitution functions. Also, we model an endogenous labor supply to integrate this domestic work, and this is based on the works of Fontana and Woods, and also Fontana in 2003. We use these papers as reference. In the household category, we have 6 categories of household according to the region and gender. The three regions, once again, highlands, valleys, and lowlands. And we introduce the regionalization of the agricultural sector. This in order to introduce after the region-specific shocks for each region in Bolivia. And finally, in terms of security, we added also to the model the calculation of indicators of food availability, food access, and food vulnerability before and after the climate shock. And this is based to the indicators that the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, have proposed. I present you in this figure the structure of the model. We have at the top our scenarios or the shock. Basically, we have 2 types of shock: change in international crisis and regional and sectoral damage due to climate change in production factors, basically capital and land for agricultural sectors. In the next slide, I explain more in detail these 2 scenarios. But we need to understand that these 2 scenarios are introduced in the closure of the CG model. This is a CG model that used mainly as a main data social economic matrix for Bolivia for the year 2012. They use some economic parameters of preferences and elasticities, and some estimates of other studies based on the time use survey of Bolivia. And the output of this CG model is change in supply, in demand, in trade, a change in the domestic production, food security, and change in prices, wages, income, GDP, etc. We linked the CG model with a microsimulation model using Stata, and the main data for this model are the results of the CG model, basically a change in the prices and wages and income. We use also the National Household Survey from 2018 for Bolivia, and the output of this microsimulation model is the change in food poverty. I present you now the shocks. The shock is only one shock, but we have 2 types of shocks. We can say internal and external. The internal shock is based on the report from Bolivia, UDAP, from UDAP 2015, and this is based on regional climate disaster recorded in Bolivia between 2013 and 2014. So this report is about damage and losses in agricultural and non-agricultural sector. So for the agricultural sector, they are integrated in the model following a region-specific approach. So we introduce the damage in each region, highlands, valleys, and lowlands. And also, we have a disaggregation according to the type of agriculture. So we have traditional, modern, and livestock products in each region. As for the non-agricultural sector, we integrate the damage and losses from a sectoral basis in the sector who recorded in the report direct damage. So these sectors are transport, electricity, water and gas, forestry and fishing, construction, and commercial and social services. Then as for the external shock, it's an external shock of change in international prices, and it takes into account an increase in the international prices of agricultural and livestock products due to climate change, and this is based on the forecast or provisions of Nelson et al. 2009. Now I present some of the results, the key results of our paper. If we see the results more negative or more relevant are located in the agricultural sector, we have a production that in general decrease of 16%, but we have some difference if we see the variation, the change according to the type of crops. So we have the traditional agriculture who recorded the largest decline, more than 21%, the livestock production 10%, and to a lesser extent, the modern agricultural production 7%. These results are in agreement with other studies that use CG models to analyze the climate change in Bolivia, Vizcarra and GEMIO, for example. However, unlike the study of GEMIO, for example, who reported most several effects of climate change in industrial or modern agriculture, we found that the greatest damage is located in the traditional agriculture. This difference can be explained because we consider in our scenario an increase of food prices, of agricultural prices, and this in some extent can be positive for modern agricultural producers. They are an incentive to sell the production, to reallocate the production in the world market, so they can benefit in some extent from this increase in world prices. At regional level, we had also difference between our three regions, and the region most affected is the highlands region, which more predominant is characterized by a traditional production. So then we have the valleys where the livestock and also the modern production records the most significant losses, around 8%. And to a lesser extent, we have the lowlands region who records the smallest losses, with the modern agricultural production being the sector less affected. We have also the impacts in the non-agricultural sector, especially in the directly affected sector, electricity, water and gas, forestry, construction, etc. They decrease. However, at the end, we have that the effect spill over to all other sectors in the economy, and in particular, two of them, trade and food industry, which record losses of 4 to 6%. So in general, we have through indirect channels, the effect is negative for all the economy and for all sectors. As production is affected in all sectors, and especially in the agricultural sector, the demand for labor and capital is also reducing, and this explains why we have a decrease in the unemployment rate, of 0.16%. Another result is that the decline in the production creates a shortage of products, and particularly the agricultural products, and this increases the final prices of goods. And we have also an increase due to the climate scenario, due to the increase in the international agricultural prices. So that's why we have an increase in the consumer price index that finally affects the real consumption of households. We see also that the consumption in female-headed households is more affected than the consumption on male-headed households. So for women, the reduction is for 3.7, and for men is 3.5. And finally, if we see the real GDP, the effect is also negative, and they decrease by 3.8%. If we see now some gender impacts in the labor market, where we have an endogenous labor supply for formal and domestic markets, we have a reduction in the employment. So in the formal market, in the formal work for men and women, for female and male. However, the domestic work increased more for women than for men. You can see in the field table 1.3 for women and 1% for men. In addition, women are more affected in the same proportion when they are skilled or unskilled. So in the second table, we have the impact of climate change on the female labor market for women by region and skilled. And we can see in this table that there are the unskilled workers who have reduction, the bigger reduction in the formal labor market. So compared to the skilled women, the unskilled has the largest declines in the formal work, as we can see in the table. And if we see the domestic work, they increase more. Mainly in two regions, in the highlands and valleys, and women of the highlands and on the valleys have the increase more important. But it increased for all women, for all households headed by women. Now I present some effects on the food security. Given that we have negative effects in the agricultural production, we expect some negative effects in the food security, and we found it. Fields, this picture is about food security in terms of food availability. So the production of the agricultural and food production that it's sale in the domestic market. We have a reduction in all crops, traditional, modern, and the food production and the food processing. However, once again, we can see that the traditional production, cereals, vegetables, fruits, or fruits, are the crops more affected. We have the largest reduction in this type of products. And once again, this type of products are more in relation with the highlands region in Bolivia, who will be the region most affected by climate change. The second indicator or the second dimension of food security is in terms of vulnerability, and this we have a decline in the production. So this creates a shortage of local products in the local market that is covered but more imports. So and this has a negative consequence because they increase the risk of food insecurity as measured by the dependence of the international markets. So we have calculated these two indicators of the FAO, the value of food imports with respect to the local demand for products, and the value of imports of with respect to the total export. Total mentioned is export, and both of them increase. That means that we have an increase of the vulnerability of Bolivia. And finally, in terms of food access, we have an increase in global prices, in the consumer price index, the local prices, and also an increase due to climate change in our climate scenario that includes an increase in world prices for agricultural and livestock products. And this has the consequence for the consumption of households. So we have a decrease in the consumption that is more important in households heated by women than those heated by men. And the products that are more affected, the consumption of products more affected, are cereals, fruits, and vegetables in Bolivia. Finally, this last slide is about the change in food poverty. And we can see that at the baseline scenario, we have a situation that it's not equal for the regions. The food poverty is higher in the highlands region, and it's more higher for women. And it increased after our climate scenario, in the scenario simulation, it increased for all households. Once again, two of the regions, highlands and valley, are more affected than the lowlands region, where we have the increase in food poverty, the lowest increase of food poverty. To conclude, we can say that this study provides some ideas about the effect of climate change on labor markets and food security, food poverty in Bolivia. In the labor market, we found that women are more affected than men due to greater reduction in the formal labor market and increases in their domestic work, especially when they are unskilled. Climate change also reduce the local agricultural supply, mainly for traditional products, and affect the food prices and food security in multiple dimensions. So we consider that priority should be given to protecting and investing in climate adaptation of traditional basic crops, because these crops are fundamental to ensure the food security. Crops like cereals, vegetables, and root crops. We have two suggestions. Our results suggest that we have the products in Bolivia and the population who is very sensitive, especially for women in the highlands region. Our results also suggest that the regional and gender gaps are worsened in a context of climate change in Bolivia, especially if we consider formal and domestic work. The last two aspects should take into account in the adoption of climate mitigation measures at the same time that will be oriented at the same time to reduce some regional and gender gaps in Bolivia. So an integrated policy approach is required. Finally, some future research from this paper is that it's better to use in the future research a dynamic CG model. We use a static CG model, and in a context of climate change, is more pertinent a CG model on dynamic, and it will be also positive to or better to integrate a satellite account to better integrate the unpaid domestic work, and maybe include the K work or other types or unpaid work, and base it to a time use survey. I think that the two last points will be the guidelines for future works. I think that we need to work more on it, and actually we are work a little on a CG, in a dynamic CG model for this paper. Thank you very much for.
Thank you very much, Luis. Once again, also very, very interesting work and results here. So let's go directly to comments and questions. And we have about 6 to 8 minutes. I see a question, and I wonder if, Jing, you want to say your question?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation, Luis. That was very interesting. So my question was specific about how the shocks are implemented in the model. So you talk about the internal shocks to the ag and the non-ag sectors, but I was wondering, was it implemented through the productivity shock or shifting of endowment supply? Could you explain that a little bit? Thank you.
I'm sorry, you say about the shocks? About the...
Yes. The shocks, how are they implemented in the model?
Okay. So the shocks are implemented in the value-added equation. So as a damage in the I'm sorry, it's not in the value-added. It's only in the capital and land production factors for the agricultural sector. So we take the report from the UDAP and we disaggregate, or we aggregate it in by regions before, and then by type of agriculture, by type of cultures, and then we calculate the amount of these losses. This From this, we calculate in the stock of capital and land in our social contract matrix. So we estimate a parameter who represent this proportion of losses, of damage and losses, and we introduce it in the model, in the capital and land equations of the model.
So it's more like a endowment shift. Because you have those damages from the climate change, you got less capital or less land could be used for agriculture production. Is that right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Any more questions or comments? You may unmute yourself if you have questions or comments.
Yeah, if nobody wants to ask me, I ask an additional question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
please go ahead.
because it's quite novel to see like the gender impact from the climate change, and I was wondering what was the main mechanism of showing this gender differences in terms of climate impact. Is it mainly through the supply side, like the male and female labor contribute to different value added to the production, or through the consumption side because they have different consumption structure, like elasticities to the prices. That's how you can link it to the food security issues. So I'm just curious about since it seems like gender and women is a key word in this project, and then how that plays out in the paper.
So I think that I don't understand all the question. Maybe you need to clarification about how we have a gender approach in this paper.
Yeah, you introduce you split labor into different categories by gender and by skill. So that's the part for the model development. But I was wondering the mechanism, like how this model specification is played out in your simulations. So how this modeling specification is linked to your results.
Okay. So in the social contract matrix, in the data we use, we have the labor market that is broken down in by skill levels. So we use we doesn't need to estimate or to disaggregate this labor market. However, we need to specify. So we use some the constant elasticity function to introduce we use lower elasticities to represent to indicate that it's difficult to change or to substitute male work or female work or skilled work and skilled work. So we model this. We only use these modifications from the data from the social contract matrix, who has already the disaggregation in the labor market by gender and also in households by gender, household by men and women.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, so it seems that we are almost out of time. Any more burning questions? Nothing? Going once, gone. So maybe it remains for me to close this session by thanking the presenters who came to, and the listeners who came to this session on labor market issues and gender welfare. It was extremely, extremely interesting. I learned a lot, and it was certainly very thought-provoking. So please thank Allow me and help me to thank our presenters and indeed as well those who participated in discussions. Thank you too to those who came and listened, and hopefully you took some notes, and we will follow up on reading the full papers from these presentations. Let me also thank our hosts, Jing and Zhang. Thank you very much. We know that if you had not been here, we would have probably been stuck in terms of technology. So thank you very much for staying with us and of course also for participating.